This is my 1991 twin-turbo 300ZX, and it hasn't run since 2016. I was able to get this 300ZX for $3,800, which is cheap because the last owner couldn't get it to run after buying it as a barn find. The good news, it is a manual transmission and it's almost all original. But the bad news is, somebody's cooked here. The previous owner tried to get this started, so the engine bay is partially disassembled, and so is the interior. But it does look like they replaced the fuel pump and the fuel filter, so we can rule that out as why it's not starting before we dive further into the diagnosis. But before we dive into working on this Z, I want to address something that you're probably thinking. How did I end up going from a Ferrari 360 to a Porsche 997 to now having this piece of shit in my garage? And to be honest, the only real way for you guys to understand is for us to take a trip back in time. My older brother Mike is 9 years older than me, and growing up we both didn't have our dad, so unfortunately he was all I had to look up to growing up. And my brother's first car was a 1990 naturally aspirated 300ZX with a salvage title. This thing was rightfully clapped, but it goes back to the philosophy, even if you don't have the nicest stuff, if you take care of it, it'll make it feel nicer. So I watched my brother invest time and money into this piece of junk that he absolutely loved, and honestly that's where my affinity for these cars started to grow. But fortunately our family actually fell on some luck, and my mom inherited a 1996 M3. Since it didn't make a great daily driver, my mom went ahead and gifted it to my brother, so he did the right thing. He sold the M3 and bought another piece of shit 300ZX, but this time it was a twin turbo. And again, I watched my brother save up money, spend a lot of time on this car. He put a still-in body kit on it, resprayed the entire thing Corvette red, and given his great decision-making skills like selling the M3, he put Lambo doors on it. But to be honest, this car did something to me. I'll never forget my brother picking me up from school, blasting 50 cents, get rich or die trying, because that's when the dream of owning a twin-turbo 300ZX was forever etched in my brain. And as badly as I'd like to find that original twin-turbo 300ZX that we had, I haven't been able to track it down. I posted on forums, and it doesn't seem that anybody has a lead on it. But it's a good reminder that every car has a story, and even though the story on this car has been silent since 2016, today we're bringing it back to life, and we're gonna continue this Z story. So starting off, I dived into removing the plenum, which is notoriously one of the most difficult maintenance items to do on this car. The spaces in which you have to work are super tight, so it makes it very difficult to remove bolts or disconnect hoses and fuel lines and stuff like that. The reason being, the 300ZX was one of the first cars to be designed using CAD, and this design process makes everything in the engine bay fit exactly like a glove, making it really difficult to work on. As I dug into it, I realized the previous owner had attempted to remove the plenum but got stuck at the EGR bolts. One of them had been removed, one of them was stripped, and the other two weren't even touched. I used a little trick to get them out. I used a stubby 1/4 inch wrench on a 10mm socket, and I was able to get them out pretty easily, even though I was only able to move the wrench maybe 1/8 of a turn at a time. And since I'm gonna be doing a coolant line delete, I didn't have to worry about disconnecting the coolant lines. I just sliced them all with a razor blade. Once I had the plenum out, I started on the coolant line delete. If you've ever had a 300ZX, you know how over-engineered these cars are. And if you're wondering why I'm removing coolant lines, they're not really effective unless you live in really cold weather where your throttle bodies are freezing. And realistically, if the temperatures are cold enough to freeze your throttle bodies, you're probably not driving a twin-turbo rear-wheel drive car. And once these coolant lines are removed, it makes the removal and installation process of the plenum much easier, so future maintenance will be a much more simple process. Then it was time for a drive down a Concept Z Performance. I got some 550cc AUS injectors with the adapter kit and an intake plenum gasket with new PCV hoses. I pulled the fuel rail from the motor and I went ahead and tapped out the old injectors. It looked like at some point 3 of the injectors had been replaced, but not recently, and the other injectors looked pretty original. And then we got ahead to putting in the new injectors. I lubed up all the seals and I pressed them into the adapter kit, and then I pressed them into the fuel rail from there. Since these injectors were not designed to go into this car, you do have to clearance the plenum, so I got out my Dremel and I went ahead and Dremeled the first runner to make sure that I could seat the connector on the injector all the way through. From there, we started the fun. I got to put the plenum back into the car, and since there were no coolant lines, this was a much simpler process. However, it does still have the EGR and the PCV, so it was pretty difficult getting those EGR bolts back in, but hopefully we delete those in the future. Once I had the EGR bolts back in and the PCV valves connected, I went ahead and carefully torqued down all the plenum bolts to 12 foot-pounds. They do thread into aluminum, so you want to be very careful because they will strip out if you over-tighten them. From there, I reinstalled all the coil packs and I reinstalled the wiring harness, and I went ahead and replaced all the fuel lines to give us a fresh look on the fuel. And I got a majority of the stuff that we needed just to start this car connected. Before we try to start the car, we do have to make one more modification. These original injectors are 370cc, and the new injectors that we put in are 550cc. So if we were to try to run the car right now, it probably wouldn't start, or if it did start, it would run really rough, just because it wouldn't be getting the correct amount of fuel. So because of that, the ECU needs a tune so that it knows to run the fuel for 550cc injectors and not 370cc injectors. So we're gonna take care of that right now, and it's actually a pretty simple process on these older cars. Believe it or not, the ECU lives under this factory piece of plywood right in the passenger footwell. And looking closely, it already has a sticker on the ECU notifying that it's been tuned before, so that's gonna make this process of tuning a lot easier. And basically what that sticker tells us is somebody went and did all the legwork to solder in a socket into the ECU so that it can accept chip tunes. So all we'll have to do is replace the chip to put in the tune that has the 550cc injectors. The chips just press in and out, so I removed the old chip and I replaced it with the new chip that has the tune for the 550cc injectors. With the new tune placed into the ECU and all the fuel lines and everything back in place, all we needed to do to get this thing started is to reconnect the battery. So I just reconnected the ground to the battery terminal, and now it was time to start this thing. Let's go! This thing hasn't run since 2016, and in a couple of days and a lot of man hours, we got it running. So I'm gonna check for leaks, make sure everything's good to go, but might even take this thing around the block. The highs and lows of working on cars switch rapidly. When I restarted the car, it fired right up. This is what happened. My entire garage was full of smoke after that. Let me know down in the comments what you think this is. It very well could just be the turbo seals have let a massive amount of coolant or oil into the turbos, and that's what's burning off. But I think before I pull this motor, I'm gonna do a leak down test and a compression test just to see where we're at. But it would be a shame to put all this work into this car and the motor be bad. So even if it is just the turbos, I still don't want to take this car on a drive. And the reason being, these are timing belt cars. And since the car's been sitting since 2016, I don't want to risk the chance of that timing belt snapping and blowing this motor if it is still good. Either way, this motor is coming out of the car, but I want to do as much diagnosis as I can right now before I pull the motor. So if you can't tell, I'm super passionate about this project and I'm really looking forward to pulling it all together. So make sure you subscribe to follow along, drop a like on the video if you feel so kind to, and I'll see you guys next time.